Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of conflicts taking place around the world. And today, we wanted to start in France. Yes, we wanted to start in the place where Joseph Biden defecated in front of the world and was unable to shake the hands of those who served during the D-Day invasion. Now, there's other things happening in France as well, and I'm going to read you the headlines. France's left-wing parties finally reach agreement on joint program for snap elections. Mail Online. France's leftist alliance leaders vow to extinguish the flame of far right in upcoming elections. You notice how they discuss right and left? Usually you will hear left, center left, leftist, but when even individuals that kind of sit in the middle, they are oftentimes categorized as being part of the far right. France vows to overturn Macron's policies if they win elections. From power play to gamble, the history of snap elections in France. French left-wing parties from Popular Front to contest snap elections. A left-wing government would spell tragedy for France. That's from The Spectator. A new European right, what the media missed in Europe's recent ... And it just goes on and on. So, are those who reasonable, those who don't want to see France turned into a cesspool of Islamo-fascists and sexual debauchery, are people finally starting to take notice? Are people finally starting to go out and actually vote against what is happening in many parts of the world? Here in the United States, for instance, and not just France, it is estimated that 37 to 40% of all holidays are now centered on some form of pansexual desire. Usually it has to do with homosexuality, transvestites, what have you, bisexualism. But 40% of holidays, entire months, are now focused on Pride months. What do fathers get? They get a day, Father's Day. What do mothers get? Mothers get a day. Veterans Day, they get a day. But those expressing a certain type of sexual desire are now getting essentially 3 months to a varying degree. And then in France, look, there's places in France, if you are a white Christian, you are not allowed to go. If you are a female and you are not dressed in the appropriate attire, you cannot go into certain areas in certain cities in France. And what's even more hilarious, I have to say, it's one of the funniest things that you can see within the political sphere, and that is Islamists pro-Palestinian Islamists teamed up with the quote-unquote queers for Palestine. So on one side, you have a group of people who reproduce like jackrabbits, who will eventually overtake your society and implement their cult-like religion on your society. On the other side, you have a group of people who do not have the ability to reproduce in any fashion whatsoever, with the exception of taking someone else's kids and then raising them themselves. Now, in a quote-unquote democracy, obviously, you can figure out who eventually is going to win. And at a certain point, those Islamists for Palestine will eventually gain power, and they will eradicate those queers for Palestine. They will cease to exist. They were just a short-term ally right now. But at a certain point, those idiotic queers for Palestine will become extinct in an Islamist takeover. And that's what you're seeing in large parts of France. That is why you're seeing people starting to vote now and take to the streets in France. The liberal policies of the Macron government, they are destroying France. And people are starting to take notice. Now we are starting to see a concern within the left, and they are starting to ally themselves. And they are going to try and take action to stem the tide of reason that is taking hold of France. Again, it's not necessarily a quote-unquote right-wing surge or a far right-wing surge. It is a group of reasonable people who do not agree with where their country is heading, and they've decided to take action. So we'll see what happens. We will definitely see what happens, but it's happening everywhere. It's happening in the United Kingdom, this quote-unquote left-right divide. Here in the United States, it's even more prevalent, well, probably equally as prevalent, and I, again, very concerned where this is going to lead when we finally get up to the elections. I don't think it's going to be pretty. I think it's going to eventually lead to some sort of conflict here in the United States, whether it's going to be an all-out armed conflict that will manifest itself into some sort of civil war. I would say that's more likely, and it is continuing to grow day by day here in the United States. There was one report as well in California. There are now more in the People's Republic of California, in certain areas in Southern California, San Francisco. There are now more flags of debauchery than there are American flags. And I've often talked about going back in time, going back to the 1950s, and asking someone or informing someone during the 1950s, the 1940s, the early 1960s, hell, even the 1970s, 1980s, that eventually this flag of debauchery would take the place of the American flag in many cities around the United States. I can tell you the city that I live in, that if you go down into some of the areas downtown, indeed, you will certainly see more flags of the debauchery rainbow than you will see American flags. Very concerning. And I have listened to persons that fly those flags of debauchery, and if they see another flag that they do not agree with, well, they're very outspoken, and it's a flag that you are not allowed to have present. You risk having that flag torn down. And it could be any flag that those on the left see as a sign of what they call nationalism. But it is perfectly acceptable for them to fly the flag of sexual nationalism, of sexual desire. Because again, at the end of the day, the rainbow flag that is displayed is simply a statement of sexual desire. Pride Month is simply a statement of sexual desire. Nothing more. Pride is just a word that is used to cover the real intent of the flag. So we'll see what happens. The war in Ukraine continues. The Russians, or rather Putin, has made an offer to the Ukrainians. Now this has happened before, and obviously the Ukrainians are rejecting it. But essentially the Russians are saying that the war can end today. There are going to have to be some territories that are given up, specifically Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And Ukraine would have to essentially declare that it will never join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, if it does that, if the Ukraine does that, then essentially the war would hit a pause button. Now, look, that's not to say that armed conflict will not break out again in the future. In terms of Western encroachment into the Ukraine, in terms of Western encroachment into the Baltic states, this has set up an environment in which conflict will be more likely. In NATO moving into Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and into Eastern Europe, again, specifically the Baltics, and its attempts to enter Ukraine will only lead to an eventual armed conflict. Without a doubt. Even if the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or Ukraine rather, does not become part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it is still going to be heavily influenced by the EU. It is still going to be heavily influenced by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is going to be supplied weapons, and its political ideology is going to gravitate towards neo-Western liberalism. This is going to inherently cause conflict between itself and its Russian neighbors. Russia is not going anywhere. And again, what Russia fears is that very neoliberalism, what I just discussed at the first part, in the first segment of this video about what's happening in France, what's happening in the United States right now. The Russians fear that happening inside of the Russian Federation. Right now, the Russians are saying, no, we're not going to accept that. It's not going to happen here. But you have organizations like Open Societies, the Tides Foundation. Their intent is to bring this neoliberalism into the Russian Federation. And right now, the Russian people are saying, no, we don't want it. I would say right now, most of the people here in the United States do not want it. Most of the people in France do not want it. Most of the people in the United Kingdom do not want it. Not sure what's going on in Germany. That's a tough one to call. We'll see what happens there. But after the rejection of the demands of the Russian Federation in terms of, hey, we can end this war today, and this is how we end it, and that is being rejected, I think at this point, the only real outcome for the Russians is to continue the conflict, continue the war. I think there's a very high probability at some point Zelensky is removed. One way or another, Zelensky will have to be removed from the body politic of the Ukraine. It's going to have to happen. Now, obviously, he is a darling of the neoliberals here in the United States. I imagine at some point, if he is not eliminated through kinetic means, that he will eventually reside inside of the United States at some point. So again, the war continues. We will continue our coverage of the conflict. We are going to, again, have more coverage of other conflicts as well, specifically the conflict in Myanmar. There is a raging civil war going on. I am still continuing a project to bring you information on that conflict, and that will occur very soon. So again, thank you for joining us today. As always, have a good day.